Hello and welcome to this module where we are going to discuss the concept of task constraints. I'm first of all going to give you a background and then I will show you how to set up constraints on MS Project. In general, a constraint is anything that holds you back, anything that prevents you from moving freely. So when you find a prisoner that is in chains both in the arms and on the legs, that person is in constraints because he's being constrained from moving to wherever he wishes to go. We have got three basic categories of task constraints. You might wonder, why do we need to constrain a task? This is because a project has got time limitations. We know the time the project must start and when the project must finish. So each task, as you see on the Gantt chart illustrated here, each task has got a preceding task, in other words, tasks that come before it, as well as succeeding tasks, tasks that come after it. So in order for us to finish the project by a particular end date, each task must happen or it must occur within the time frame in which it was budgeted. So there is a limit to which we can change the start date or the end date of a task. So that's why we can put constraints which define how flexible a task can be. And task constraints are only applicable to automatically scheduled tasks, because the task constraint won't mean much on a manually scheduled task because you have to change the date yourself. But with an automatically scheduled task, MS Project automatically changes and it shifts around the rest of the project tasks the moment the duration or the start date or end date of a particular task has been changed. So the first category of constraints is the flexible constraints. The flexible constraints give a general rule. For example, we can say each task must start as early as possible or as late as possible without putting the constraint of a date. So in other words, we do not put a fixed date for starting or for finishing a task. So MS Project is free to move around that task so that the best possible end date is achieved. Then we have what we call semi-flexible constraints. So a semi-flexible constraint will put a date boundary, but it can only define one date. For example, we can specify the date by which a task must have started, or we can specify the date by which a task should have finished. So there's a date constraint, but we can only put that constraint on one side, either on the starting or on the finishing date. Then we've got a third constraint category, which is the inflexible constraint. This is a hard constraint or a rigid constraint. We also give a date boundary. So either a start date or an end date. But in this case, once we specify a start date, the task is forced to start on that particular date. If we specify an end date, then the task is forced to finish on that particular date. In these three categories, the flexible, semi-flexible and inflexible constraints, we find 8 variations. In the flexible category, there are 2 types of constraints. The first one says the task must start as soon as possible. So in other words, MS Project will schedule the task to occur at the earliest possible date. So this is the default constraint type if we are scheduling from the start date. Scheduling from the start date means that we use the start date as the reference point for scheduling tasks. So if our start date is the 1st of January, then we start scheduling tasks from the 1st of January going forwards. But if we are scheduling the project from the end or from the finish date, what it means is that we are setting a boundary for the finish date for the project. We want the project to be done by the 30th of June. So if we want it done by the 30th of June, we have to work backwards and schedule the tasks from the last task until we get to the first task. So at the end of the scheduling, we will now know by which date must the project start in order to finish on the 30th of June. So if we are scheduling from the finish date, under the flexible constraints, we use the type as late as possible so that MS Project will schedule the tasks to occur at the latest possible date. Then we come under the semi-flexible category. The first one is start no earlier than. So remember we said that with the semi-flexible, it's either you specify the earliest start date or the latest. So in this case, what we are saying is this date we are providing is the earliest start date. So this task must not start before the 1st of January. So it can only happen on the 1st of January or after the 1st of January. So that is on or after the constraint date. Then we have the second type under the semi-flexible, which is start no later than. So this one is giving the latest start date. So the first one gives you the earliest start date. Start no later than gives you the latest start date. So the task is supposed to start on or before the constraint date. Then the third type under the semi-flexible category now has to do with the finish date. So we call it finish no earlier than. So it causes the task to finish on or after the constraint date. So in other words, we are saying this task must not finish before this date. This is usually important where, for example, the moment a task is finished, another is supposed to be starting immediately. Or when the output of a task cannot wait even for a day before it is used in another task. So in other words, we want to make sure that the moment we finish that task, then the next step is ready to be done. A very good example would be if we are producing something that needs to be delivered and the transport is only available on Monday and we do not have a place to store the things overnight. So it means that whatever we are producing can only be finished when the transport is available. So we are saying it cannot be finished before this particular date. So this is where we put the finish no earlier than, so that we make sure that by the time it's finished, the transport is already there to carry the stuff. Then the next one is finish no later than. So the finish no later than is used to schedule a task so that it finishes on or before the constraint date. So in other words, if it is finished after the constraint date, it causes the other tasks to delay. So let's say, for example, using the same example of the transport. If the transport will not be available after Monday, then it means that this task must not go beyond Monday. It has to finish by Monday. So this is in a case where it is possible to keep that product we are making in our task even for days before the transportation is ready. So we are saying you can finish it earlier, but the latest it must finish is on Monday, because after Monday there is no more transportation. Or in the case of our scheduling, if it finishes after Monday, then it causes the rest of the tasks to be delayed. So at the end of the day, you push the finish date later than what you have initially scheduled. The next type of constraints are under the inflexible category. So remember, the inflexible is what we called the hard constraints, the ones that cannot be changed, which cannot be altered. So we also specify either a start date or a finish date. So if we specify a start date, then the type is called must start on. It causes the task to start strictly on that constraint date. It cannot start earlier or later. Same thing with the must finish on constraint. We specify the finish date, and then the task has to finish strictly on that constraint date, that finish date that we have specified. Next, we are going to look at how we can apply a constraint on a task. So in order for you to do any operation on a task, you have to select that specific task. So let's select the first task, which is draw the plan. You can click once on the task name, then you go to the task information by selecting the task tab, and then on the task tab we look for the information. So that information is under properties group. So you go to the properties group and then you click on the information. And remember, this is the long way. The shortcut to the task information is to simply double click on that particular task. So when you double click, it is the same as going to the task tab, then to properties and to information. Once we are on the task information page, we need to go to the advanced tab. Then once we are on the advanced tab, we look for constraint type. So remember, we said the default constraint is as soon as possible. All the constraint types are here. as late as possible, as soon as possible, finish no earlier than, finish no later than, must finish on, must start on, start no earlier than, start no later than. All these constraint types, they require a date except as late as possible and as soon as possible. So these two do not require a date, but finish no earlier than needs a date because you are saying it must finish no earlier than this particular date. Same with finish no later than, or must finish on a particular date, must start on a particular date, start no earlier than the specified date, and start no later than the specified date. So the defaults do not need a date, and the constraint date comes here where it says constraint date. So for as late as possible and as soon as possible, the constraint date is not applicable. So let's apply the finish no later than constraint, and then we select a constraint date. I have to go back to October and make it the 19th of October. So once I've done that, I now have a constraint on this task. And because I've got a constraint, you can see that on this column here, the very first column, my icon is different. And if I put my cursor there, it gives me the screen tip which says this task has a finish no later than constraint on Monday, the 19th of October. So I've just put a constraint finish no later than. The rest of these tasks by default were given as soon as possible. If the constraint says the task must start as early as possible, then it means that after the finish date of the preceding task, the next task is scheduled to start immediately the day after the previous one has finished. So that's the meaning of as early as possible. I'd like you to play around with the different constraint types. You can select various tasks, double click on a task, go to the advanced tab, and then you change the constraint type and specify a constraint date. And remember, when it's as soon as possible and as late as possible, you do not need any constraint dates. Okay, next let me show you how to remove a constraint type if you had applied a constraint type other than as soon as possible, which is the default. So let's go back to draw the plan and double click, and then on the constraint type under advanced, it's saying finish no later than. So to reset it, you simply select as soon as possible, because that is the default for all the tasks in MS Project. When you select as soon as possible, the constraint date is still there, but it doesn't matter because it will change it automatically to non-applicable the moment you close and it saves. So if you went back by double clicking, you'll see that the constraint date is now reset to non-applicable. So that is how you remove a constraint. You simply reset it to as soon as possible. So I would like you to play around with a number of these tasks and practice setting up constraints. It's a very easy exercise for constraints other than as soon as possible and as late as possible. You are supposed to supply a constraint date, which is either a start date or a finish date. So remember to save your project before you close and go to the next module. So we'll see you in the next video.